Well, you may already have, but I was going to say, like, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and the Federalist Papers.
But like you said, philosophy is about articulating what we already know, and that's not really helpful.
It's extremely helpful.
No, it's helpful for articulating what I already believe, but it's not helpful for understanding if my beliefs are different from yours.
No, not to confirm what you already believe, but to help you make sense of what you already know about your own existence and about the world around you, because we have a difficult time with that.
What do you mean? I mean, that's not the issue we have. I mean, you and I have different agreements on like greater concepts, like the kind of correlation between labor and capital.
Labor and capital.
That was the only
okay, well, let me touch on that.
That was
a
the
little
later
bit.
disagreement we have.
I'll
Because you and I
that...
more or less agree for different foundational. I think we are. I guess you're more articulate in the philosophical sense, whereas I'm just approaching it from a purely Christian sense, I guess.
Okay, well, the reason, well, that's I don't take issue with that. I don't take issue with any, or nor do I criticize anybody's religion. But the theological principles that you're talking to are ones that I once shared and might share again at some point. But when we talk about, because you talk a lot about, Davis did this more, and I don't lump you in with him because I know that you guys had a falling out, but people in that sphere, I've noticed, talk a lot about Western society, Western values, and Western traditions, and they express trepidation over us losing Western values and Western traditions. But I find that 9 times out of 10, when I talk about Western values and Western traditions, it's like the first they've heard of it. And I find that really puzzling. And I think you would be better served having a more comprehensive knowledge of those traditions and those values, starting from the 2,000-year plus conversation that we've had that's led to the society that we have today. I think you would be better served having as I say, a more comprehensive knowledge of that stuff, because when you talk about preserving Western traditions and Western values, there's a lot of really good stuff there, and there's a lot. The foundations of that are, I think, critical, and I think those foundations are being lost, not because of leftism or liberalism or atheism or anything like that, but because we don't teach philosophy anymore. We don't teach those things. The philosophy as it is studied and taught has ceased to be everybody's business. Philosophy as it's studied and taught has been relegated to the humanities and electives and this specialized discipline in universities, and that's very bad. That's why we're losing Western society and Western values, and I think that's a big mistake. So I would recommend starting with those things. I'll text you. I'll send you on Discord a list of things that I and maybe some links.
Oh, I see. So you were hearing, like, I guess you were associating me with the kind of people who on YouTube will say we must save Western civilization, we must save the West. And
I think you've articulated something.
Yeah, and you want me to be more informed on how to best express those.
I think it would be good for you to have a more comprehensive understanding of what that means, because I agree with the statement. It's just really troubling to me when I talk to people, like, in good faith, who, like, oh, okay, so yeah, you know what, I agree, we do need to save Western civilization, like the whole idea of property rights, like, when you perform, we're all born with the ability to perform labor, so we have the natural right to the fruits of our labor, and we add and people are like, huh, what, wait, say that again, really? Oh, I never thought about, like, it's the first they've heard of it.
I mean, like, what you're saying, like, when you first explained to that, the thing is, that made perfect sense to me. Like, when you say, like, when we apply labor to something that becomes our property, that makes perfect sense.
Absolutely, and absolutely, because it's not this is another thing that people get disappointed with when they study philosophy. It doesn't give you, like, profound wisdom like they think gurus do or something like that. It's just stuff that's so rudimentary and basic you probably hadn't thought about it before. That's how it was to me too.
Yeah, and that is what philosophy is. Like, when I first tried to read philosophy, it was very basic. I thought, like, this is, like, I kind of looked over it, like, this is kind of a waste of time when I first read it.
Yeah, a lot of people feel that way, but what we don't understand, at least what I came to find out later, what my namesake, my first philosophy professor, Mr. Warren, called it he said it very dramatically. He said the sting of philosophy. He said he described it as getting stung by a thing that infects you with a desire to think philosophically. And I have to say, I was definitely stung way back in 2005. But I think if you did that, I think if you, with all due respect, and I want to put this as respectfully as I can, I think if you resisted the temptation to see this as a conflict between Christianity and secularism and saw it more as a totality of a long conversation that involved both, I think you would be better served going forward in the kinds of things that you stand for when you make videos, because
in regards
these
to...
things are...
Can you give me a good example, or is it
sure?
I'm trying to understand the point of your concern.
Sure. Okay. So when we talk about, for example, the conflict that we're having right now on the dumb internet college kid idea of socialism and capitalism. So when 99 times out of 100, when people, and by the way, this is proof positive that it's not just you. When I talk to people who purport themselves to be Marxists, and I talk to them about Marx, it's also the first they've heard of it. They don't know. They don't know what they're talking about. They've never read Marx. They might have read the manifesto, but they've never read anything else. And they probably didn't read it. They probably heard it talked about by some guy on YouTube, and they don't know the first thing about Marxist concepts. Now, if you're gonna espouse something, you'd probably be better served if you knew something about it, right? So they keep talking about Marxism and they don't know the first thing about it. And I critique Marxism, and they unwittingly agree with me because they have no idea what it is. So
so Marxists
in order
do that.
to
So Marxists agree with your critique, or
they end up when I say that capitalism should be made ubiquitous, they absolutely agree. And then I say, well, didn't Marx say that we should abolish private property? Oh, I never thought of that. Yeah, that's kind of a contradiction, isn't it? Maybe you should have thought about that a little bit more before you got on board with this whole stupid thing.
I'm not a Marxist, though. I've never really agreed with that.
No, not you. When I talk to other Marxists, when I say that capital should be made ubiquitous, they instantly agree with me. But they fail to understand that Marx...
Oh, yeah. So I guess you really like that Distributus video I sent you.
That's and what he said, by the way, that's exactly been my... I don't mean to use somebody else as a proxy for myself, but it was so identical to my very first impression of Marxism when I was done actually studying it. It's 1-to-1. He's exactly right. The problem isn't that... The problem is that not enough people are capitalists. Not that too many, not that capitalism itself. That's absolutely right. And his critique of Marxism his critique of communism, not that it's failed everywhere it's been tried. No, it hasn't. That depends on what you mean by failed, or it leads to totalitarianism. Not necessarily. The fundamental, irrefutable critique of communism is that it doesn't solve the problems that it identifies in capitalism. That is everybody misses that except that guy. It doesn't solve the problems that exist in capitalism. It assumes that by its benevolent nature that it will solve them by default. That's what Marx said. He said that all of the capital would be in a state monopoly. He's at a state monopoly, and that the political power would eventually liquidate itself, because once people weren't working to oppress everybody, but they were working for their own betterment, that the political power would liquidate itself. Political power doesn't liquidate itself ever.
No.
That's why
no, it does not.
It doesn't. It proliferates. So all good stuff.
Even every anti-communist who has a simplistic approach of communism never works understands that much.
Well, because it can't. Man is a political animal. We're by nature. We construct political institutions by nature, for the same reason that beavers construct dams. You're never going to liquidate political power. You're never going to be absent political structures, even if it's a tribe. It's impossible. But he didn't see that because because Marx thought that. he was so... Well, we're not even to get into that, because I could talk for hours about why Marx was wrong. But my point is, the reason that I was able to identify what that guy did very early in my community college years, when all these people tried to conscript me into being a Marxist or whatever, is because I had studied the history of Western philosophy at that time, or was studying it diligently at that time, from Plato all the way up to whoever it would be now.
And what was it that like was the indicator for you?
What's that?
Like for me, it was just an obvious, like more like my critique of communism was basically the real, this overseas simplistic critiques of it. But what was it for you that in philosophy that made you realize that Marx didn't know what he was doing?
So when I read I don't have it on hand. So when I read Marx's prescription that private property be abolished, I immediately, because I guess my brain was trained to think philosophically or logically or whatever it may be, when he said that, I immediately identified that it was at odds with his notion of ubiquitizing capital, that you can't abolish private property and extend it at the same time. And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to extend private property by abolishing it. You can't do both of them.
Yeah, this is primarily the reason why I now refer to capitalism as a basic human right, because it's predicated on a basic human right.
So let me touch on that a little bit. So we were talking earlier about property rights and then the relationship between labor and capital. Let me try to make that a little bit more sharp for you. So if you're on board with at least my descriptive statements about how property rights come into being, that we're born with the ability to perform labor, and through our labor we add something of ourselves to nature to make it our own property, and what we're making our property is that which we need to survive and have a good life and all that. Build a house, gather the goods that we need, the real goods that we all need to be able to live well, to live well. Those are two different things. So if you're on board with that's where property rights come from. So that means that because all human beings, barring certain exceptions like deformities and whatnot, people that need to be cared for, all human beings, all things being equal, are born with the means of production. The means of production being labor power. In a pre-industrial society, the means of production was labor power.
So at this point, born with the means of production is just manual labor itself at this point.
Correct. That's what generated the wealth. Wealth being that which you need in order to be alive and live well. That's what that means. So build huts, gather food, do all that stuff. So because everybody was born with that, the means of production was democratically, in a figurative sense, because we're just talking about nature, but the means of production was, in a figurative sense, democratically distributed. It was distributed one man, one labor power, different in quality. Some people were better at building houses, some people were stronger, some people were bigger, but everybody had the ability to perform labor to gather the things they needed to live and to live well. So private property, nature's economic system, which is again figurative because nature isn't a conscious being, but the economic system that man is suited to by nature is private property, individual property rights. It's based upon that by man's nature.
All right.
Now, okay, so the ability to acquire private property in order to live and to live well was every man's by right, because it was his from birth. It was his by nature. He was born with it. That's what a birthright means. You're born with it. So he was born with the ability to acquire private property to live and to live well. Now, along comes the Industrial Revolution. And labor being the input into the economy, when we started having economies, which we did very early in human society, labor's input into the economy started to become less and less and less, and capital's input into the economy started to be more and more and more. Capital being the instrument that produces the wealth. So let's go to the example.
Or to put another way, you need fewer people to produce the same amount of goods.
Correct. Well, you will less and less labor. Yes, less and less labor.
So in other words, so capital. So in the earlier days, we had all this. We had basically everyone had to work through labor, but eventually capital became like what do we call capital or assets or means of production?
Sure.
Became so independent from labor that you didn't need as many people to produce.
You didn't need people to produce, so labor, and a consequence of that is that labor was no longer the thing producing the wealth. So the consequence of it was capital. Now, whatever you want to call that, again, I think we have got an idea of what that means. It's the thing that makes money for you. So less and less
like
labor.
A shovel would be like a piece of capital.
So a shovel would be a tool that an individual could make and possess for themselves to use. A shovel factory would be capital. So if you're capable, if you own something that produces goods, so there's consumer goods and producer goods. If you own producer goods, you own the new means of production. New in the sense that the input that labor had into the economy and the input that capital had in the economy from the 18th century to the 21st century has roughly changed places.
Oh, so a factory would be new labor, whereas as opposed to manual human labor.
A new form of it's a change in the way that people do the world's work. It's a change in what the means of production is, from labor intensive to capital intensive. Now, a consequence of that, if we can assume for the sake of argument that's true, I think it's pretty self-evidently true. If we accept that, then a consequence of that is the fact that the means of production was our birthright. But the means of production is now something external to ourselves that we're not born with anymore.
Well, the old means of production, the labor was our birthright, but these new means are not.
Correct. Now there's something external to ourselves. So, a consequence of that, under the principle of justice and of rights, is that people born without capital ought to be equipped with it.
In what sense?
That is literally an academic technical conversation in the field of economics that I can't just, it would be hours, and it would be, I think you bought a copy of Democracy and Economic Power, right? Didn't you say
do I have that? I have it somewhere. I haven't finished it.
Okay, if give it a once over, but it goes into detail of how that can be accomplished. But the moral argument is that because the means of production cease to be something that we're born with, that it ought to be something that we're equipped with during our lifetime. We shouldn't be deprived of the means of production. Now, that Marx recognized that too. The difference was that he couldn't understand how to achieve that without the sacrifice of individual freedom. And the good thing about the kind of economic policy that I would be talking about, which is binary economics, where we equip people with capital over their lifetime, is that it aims at all the, I'm quoting Adler here, but it aims at all the good outcomes of the communist ideology, with one difference: it wants those things and freedom too. So, yeah,
that's important.
It's very important. It's something that It's something that Marx couldn't see. And by the way, the Hegelian link between Marx and the Hegelian roots of Marxist ideology, I was really impressed that he understood that. At first I was like, wait, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and then I realized that he was being satirical. Everything else, he knows his stuff. I don't have to say anything about that, but we're in total agreement. But you see what I mean? So that is the kind of practical application of a capitalist, the kind of economy that I want to see is one in which every man is a capitalist. So if you think about this too,
and just to let you know, I agree with that.
wonderful. Then we have no problem. But that's the kind of counter argument that needs to be given to these kids, because when you
that distinction, so I really appreciate that. That distinction is really important. When you're explaining that distinction is really important, though.
It really is, because that approach And the approach being really just explaining why capitalism is good and why rights are good and why property rights are good. When I tell that to these kids who claim to be Marxist without even presenting it as a challenge to Marxism, holy me, they're completely on board because it makes sense, because it's true of human nature. It's true, it's right, it's just. Everybody can live well. Everybody wants to live well. We have the perfect means, better than ever before, to live well. The only problem is a distribution problem. It's not a problem of there's capitalism versus anything else. It's how do you efficiently and intelligently equip people born without capital with it over their lifetime? That's the question that we need to be asking. And when you frame it that way, what you avoid is an us versus them dichotomy. It's not an ideology versus ideology. We all live in the same world. We all want to live well, right? So we have our ideologies really get in the way of identifying the fact that we're all in the same ocean. Everybody wants to live well. Everybody likes capitalism, whether they would admit to it or not. Everybody likes the fact that we have cheap, affordable video games. Everybody likes the fact that we have, compared to the entire history of the rest of the world, affordable as fuck housing, right? Everybody likes
except
these
things. Except in California.
Right? Yeah, unless in California. I agree with you. I live in California, so I can attest to that. But no, compared to, the place that I live in that's expensive is in California would have been like somebody from like the 17th century would have looked at this and said, "Are you a king? Are you a god? What is this? Yeah. What is this magical wonderland?" All these things are relative, right? But no, according to modern standards, it shouldn't be this expensive. You're right, but nevertheless, that's what I'm getting at. That's the approach that we ought to take, and that is a way that we can take. I don't want to make it sound like I'm looking for a way to manufacture an argument, but I really believe this. These are the principles that I was convinced of through my long years of boring study of really dry philosophers and the history of Western civilization. That's what I was left with believing. These are the things that I really believe in, and I think that if we followed the linear progression of Western thought, not the modern Democratic or Republican Party internet blog thing, whatever that is, but if we followed the actual linear progression of Western thought and Western values, we would be much better off than where we are now, sitting in these little ideological American political party bubbles, and which I see too much happening on the internet, if that makes sense.
And this is one of the reasons why I really want to have conversations with people. The one that when I first talked to you when I first had that message on my video about why representation is a lie, that's what I wanted. Because you and I would never, because you and I would probably gone back and forth on a Discord endlessly because of terminology, but having you actually explain that to me makes perfect sense now.
And this is I don't know if you're familiar with a YouTuber called Destiny.
Oh yeah, I know him.
Okay, so I'm at odds with him in almost every way, shape, and form most of the time.
I probably too.
But he said something that I thought was very, very true. He said that today, when people's views come from one of two places usually. He said it's either a visceral reaction, like what is it, like we're gonna increase your taxes. Oh, I don't want my tax. It's just a visceral reaction, or it's, well, what does my group say about this? So somebody's proposing universal healthcare. Now I'm a progressive, so I'm supposed to be for universal healthcare, so I'm for it. And that those are kind of the two modes of thought that people engage in today. I think that that's very true, and I think that as much as we can possibly avoid that, we need to avoid that. And the way that and the means by which I've avoided that in the development of internet has been through the study of Western thought and Western philosophy. I keep saying that, but that's where it comes from, which includes Christianity, by the way, and Christian values.
Yeah, for me, I don't believe the West could exist without Christianity.
Well, the West existed without Christianity, but Christianity was compatible with the Western values at the time because Christianity was an individualistic religion in an individualist tradition. So when Aristotle talked about justice, when he said that you should be just in respect to others because it's in your interest to do so, because it's part of a whole good life, that's kind of like for its own sake. So I think you would agree with me theologically that we shouldn't be good because we're afraid of going to hell or because we're afraid of the consequences. The really highest good is to be good for its own sake, because it's commanded by God. To love God for its own sake is the highest.
Yeah, because Jesus never said love. Yeah, Jesus never said love your neighbor as yourself or else. He always said love your neighbor as yourself. And that's
correct. So that was that is the same kind of, for lack of a better word, formula as a description of natural ends and natural means. So that was fully compatible with, in fact, the reason that if you read Thomas Aquinas, you're going to get a crash course in Aristotle, because Aquinas was so inspired by Aristotle that he applied the natural means and the natural ends ultimately to God and the kingdom of heaven, because that would be the natural end, right? The natural end of a human life, as opposed to simply having had a good one, would be having had one that makes you worthy of the kingdom of heaven, because that's where you're naturally inclined to go, right? That was the kind of thing that I highly recommend Aquinas to you. But my point is, that was a whole conversation within the Western tradition that was the Christianity element being fully compatible with the ideals at the time, and eventually with the ideals in America. You know, in the Declaration, they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's interesting. They said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Well, why? So that doesn't mean we hold the truth to be self-evident that people are created or have a Creator. That was taken for granted. They're endowed by their Creator, so it's taken for granted that they're creations. Why would we say that it's self-evident that they're endowed by? They don't have, just because you have a Creator doesn't mean you're endowed with natural rights. If you have a Creator, you could be endowed with nothing. You could be a programmed robot. Why would they say that it's self-evident that they were endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights? The answer to that question is exactly what we were talking about before. The observations about private property, everything that I described in that seemed to resonate with you, that's what they were. That was the evidence that made it evident to them that we were endowed with natural rights, because that was our nature to have that, and our nature was given by God, and so we were endowed with natural rights. It's a very interesting combination of secular assertions and secular observations and somewhat theological principles. Really, when you really read it in the context that the founding fathers, who were familiar with all of these philosophical things that we're talking about, we really read it in its richest context. It gives you chills. Like, there's nothing else like it on earth.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for that.
Of course, yeah, sure. So I'll tell you what. Since it's a little after 1:30, I think we went on for the hour that you wanted. I'm going to go ahead and call it here, but I will definitely send you that reading list, and I'll send you some links to audiobooks that I've read or listened to over and over again that I think you will really, really profit from.
All right, cool. Thank you very much for the thank you for willing to chat with me.
Awesome-tastic. Anytime. I hope we do it again sometime.
Me too.